Okay, in terms of the stuff, as always, just bad news. Someday good news, but not today. Deadline, same as been all along. Quizzes for part 1, deadline by September 18th, this Friday. End of day, so 59 p.m. Exam number 1 covers stuff we're talking about now. Quizzes part 2, deadline October 16th. Exam 2, quizzes part 3, deadline November 13th. Exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4, deadline December 4th. Then exam number 5, the final deadline is Friday, December 11th afternoon. For the paper, if you want to do a draft, be sure to get that by November 16th. If you want the +5 bonus in the paper, be sure to have that uploaded to Blackboard by November 18th. For full credit, up to Blackboard by November 25th, and for half credit, onto Blackboard by December 4th. Also, I got summoned for jury duty. This will be my 5th time since 2010, September 28th. So I'll be jury dutying then, as opposed to class. What I'll do is I'll do videos, put them up in lieu of class. And depending if I get picked or not, then there'll be, I guess, either more videos or not videos, as the case may be. But I got jury duty down pretty well now. I've done it so many times. I actually have a kit. I just put together my jury duty kit, and I just leave it in my closet, and get my summons, and take the kit out, you know, put in water bottle, snacks, and then go to jury duty. Okay, so last time we're looking at applying moral principles. And we saw the basic idea of the method is, you know, fairly generic. The first step is you lay out the principle, whatever it is. Like the example you used last time, an athlete's principle might be that, you know, cheating is wrong. And second thing is you take whatever you're applying the principle to. In the example last time we used the performance enhancing substance, and that being regarded as cheating. And then of course the conclusion would be that using that substance would be wrong. And we saw that when building a moral principle, you want it to be, you know, clear, coherent, plausible, matching our moral intuitions, or if it goes against our intuitions, you know, providing reasons why we should accept it over our intuitions, and ideally backed up by some sort of arguments. And then we looked at how one could respond back to this. One option is to criticize the principle and say that the principle itself is not, you know, a very good one, that it's defective in some way. Another option is to go after what it's applied to and say that what it's applied to really doesn't have those qualities. And of course the third option is to replace or try to argue that instead of accepting this principle, that an alternative principle should be accepted. Before pressing on to our new stuff, namely applying moral theory, anything about this that needs more?
What was the second one you said?
Oh, the second...
you say you can criticize the principle, and then what was the second after that?
Second one is to go after what it's being applied to,
Oh, okay.
and try to show that it doesn't fit under that principle. For example, a person's principle might be that cheating is wrong. And they might take the view that, say, using a particular substance is cheating. And it may be, you know, one would argue and say, well, using that is not actually cheating. You know, for example, there are many performance-enhancing substances that are accepted. Caffeine, Powerade, Gatorade, the gels and goos and so forth. So a person can say, well, this substance really isn't, it helps you, but it's not really cheating. So it'd be a, you know, one way of doing that in that particular case. Anything else? Now, when we get to part 2, we'll look at some various moral theories. Not all of them. People have been grinding out moral theories for thousands of years, and people keep cranking them out in journals and articles and books. But we'll look at some of the classic big ones. Now, just like with applying a moral principle, you can also apply a moral theory. If applying a moral principle, I gave the sort of analogy of why reinvent the wheel. With applying a moral theory, it's kind of like, why reinvent the automobile? And so a moral theory, as we'll see in part 2, is a systematic and developed attempt to provide an account of good and bad, right and wrong. Essentially, ethics, telling us what we should do, what we shouldn't do, justifying all that stuff. Now, since the paper for the class is relatively short, you wouldn't be building your own moral theory. Building a moral theory is something you do, like if you're writing a really big book, maybe for like tenure to be famous or something. Now, so you probably won't be creating your own moral theory, but fortunately, since, as I mentioned, people have been cranking out moral theories for thousands of years, if you need to use one, there are pre-built ones. And so you could take them and use them in your paper to make an argument. You don't have to, of course. You don't have to use any of these particular methods. You do have to argue, but you don't have to pick any particular method. Now, how do you use this method? Well, it's very similar and analogous to applying moral principle. The only difference is, instead of applying just a principle, you apply either the theory or, more likely, some kind of piece taken out of the theory. So the first step would be presenting the relevant piece of the theory. Second step is applying that to whatever it is you're applying it to, and then drawing the appropriate conclusion. To give a concrete example. Suppose you're doing a moral argument based on, say you're doing something based on consequences. You want to argue that because there is more harms than benefits, that based on the consequences something is wrong. And what you need to do is provide a reason why people should think that assessing based on consequences is the moral way to do it. And one way you can do this is make use of John Stuart Mill's moral theory of utilitarianism. He's done all the arguing for that. So you could take out a piece of his theory, plug it in there, and use it that way. And to establish that we should do morality based on consequences. We could say using the theory of utilitarianism. Another example, one thing we'll see when we talk about our very last method called mixing norms. One common technique is going from one normative area, say religion to morality, or religion to law. And people often want to go from one area to another, from law to morality, or morality to law. And as we'll see when we get to mixing norms, one good question is, how do you justify that move? How do you go from this is in my religion to this should be law? Or this is morally wrong, this should be illegal. Or this is illegal, therefore it's morally wrong. Well, fortunately, one sort of easy way to do that is applying moral theory. Essentially what you do is you take a pre-existing moral theory that does that for you, and then you use it to make the transition. For example, suppose somebody wants to, let's use something torn from today's headlines. Suppose someone wants to argue that something that is against their religion is also immoral. So, therefore it's wrong. Well, one way they could do this, a very easy way to do this, is to use a pre-existing moral theory called divine command theory. And divine command theory works like this. The theory says that something is evil because God forbids it. So it's evil because he forbids it. And something is good means that God commands it. And that's straightforward divine command theory. And so one way to argue, for example, that, say, same-sex marriage is immoral, you could go and say, I will be using divine command theory, which is the theory that what God commands is good because he commands it, and what he regards as bad or forbids is wrong because he commands it, or rather forbids it. And you could go through and quote Leviticus about relations between same sexes, and then draw the appropriate conclusion. If this is forbidden by the religion, given divine command theory, this would be morally wrong. So that'd be a straightforward argument from a religious view. Divine command theory converts it to, flesh it to ethics, and so that's how you could use that theory. Now suppose you want to get from law to ethics. And people often want to do that. They'll say, well, if something's illegal, then it's wrong. Or if it's legal, it's okay. And there's a moral theory called legal positivism, or legalism, the Chinese version, that works kind of the same way as divine command theory does. For the legalist, whatever is legal is right. Whatever is legal is wrong. If someone would argue that same-sex marriage is morally okay, they could use legalism. They could say, the theory is legalism. Whatever is legal is good. Same-sex marriage is now legal, therefore it's good, through the use of legalism. So that's how we apply moral theory. The basic idea is you can use pre-existing moral theory, you pull out the piece that you need to use, plug it into your argument, and get the result that you want. Now, kind of the weak point of this method is, unless you argue in favor of the theory, if someone doesn't find the theory particularly appealing, they'll obviously not find your argument appealing. But it's a legitimate way to argue. And many papers are written in philosophy and books, written within the context or the assumption of a particular theory. They'll be writing, say, within the context of utilitarianism, blah, blah, blah. Or in the context of deontology, blah, blah, blah. Now, how do you tell when you get a good moral theory? Well, it's kind of similar to the moral principle. The theory has got to be clear, coherent, consistent, match our intuitions, or if it breaks them, provide reasons why. It's going to provide reasonable solutions to moral problems, etc., etc. And we'll spend, when we get to part 2, talking about moral theories, we'll go over in some detail about how to tell if you've got a good theory or not. Now, suppose you're on the receiving end of one of these. Someone has broken out a theory, or you do a paper, and you've used applying a moral theory, and you want to bring up an objection to it, the paper requires, then reply to that. Well, here's how to do it. Not surprisingly, there are, once again, the 3 approaches. Option 1. You can try to show there's some kind of defect with the theory. Now, fortunately, just as people have been cranking out moral theories for thousands of years, theory for you, theory for you, theory for everybody, people have been cranking out objections against them. And every moral theory has got and we'll see this in part 2, has got a pre-built set of objections. And so one easy way to sort of raise an objection or try to counter applying moral theory is just break out the stock arguments against it, or come up with a new one as well. So option 1 is to try to show there's something defective about the theory or that part of it. Option 2 is to try to show that whatever is being talked about here doesn't fit in the theory, to go after that part. And option 3 is counter theory, to try to argue there's a better theory for handling that situation. Now, in terms of the paper, again, since the paper is pretty short, you're probably not going to be engaged in big battles of theories. But I wanted to include it because for the sake of completeness, and also because from a practical standpoint, it can be useful to use pre-existing theories to make your case. Okay, so that's applying the moral theory. And we'll spend part 2 going over particular theories and seeing them being applied. Before pressing on to our next method, anything about this that needs more stuff? We now turn to the classic, the plain God argument. Now, the reason why I include this is for a couple of reasons. One is that pretty much in any TV show or movie which involves, sci-fi tampering with living creatures, creating shark octopuses or, I don't know, squirrel tigers or spider goats or something, there's always a part where one of the characters says, that's playing God. Or they say that's what, when the sharktopus is tearing through people, they say, that's what you get for playing God. And so it occurs a lot, in sci-fi, horror movies, etc. There's always some character in such cases who says, that's playing God, or we shouldn't play God. I mean, kind of what people often take away from books, like Frankenstein, is we shouldn't play God. Now, the second reason is, when people are engaged in moral discussions, again, typically involving things like tech, genetic modification, killing people, etc., they'll bring out the playing God point. Like someone will say, to give a couple examples. One that people often say with to use a concrete example, everyone's probably heard of, in vitro fertilization, etc. When people have trouble with fertility, there's things that they can do. One thing that scientists have developed kind of from that process is they develop not super reliable, but, sort of reliable means of gender selection. And what scientists can do now through various methods, it's not foolproof, but they can allow couples to pick baby girl, baby boy. Not guaranteed, but they can alter the probability. And of course, when I was reading, first time I read about this, the person of course made the point, but that's playing God. We should just let things go as they should. It's up to God to decide. No argument given, but they did throw out the playing God. Another objection, whenever people bring up things like euthanasia or capital punishment, someone literally bring the point that that's playing God. That people are supposed to die in God's time and not a decision of other people. And so it's fairly commonly used. Now most of the time, it's just drama. The character in the movie saying, that's playing God. Or somebody like in an article, writing along, this is playing God. And there's no argument. All they've got is, admittedly a kind of a cool saying, but saying playing God proves nothing. Now, but there can be, and people use it so much, that I felt obligated to show that there could be an argument, a real argument built out of this, rather than just waving one's fist, yelling, playing God. So how do you make that happen? Well, basically there are two avenues of approach. One is a literal approach. To make this method work, what you need to do is establish only a few things. One, God exists. Two, that God sets limits on what we're supposed to do. We can operate within, this boundary, these boundaries, and then God reserves for himself certain other things that are forbidden to us. And this is a literal version. This is the idea that God has set boundaries, he exists, he set boundaries, and that crossing those boundaries would thus be wrong. Now, if that can be shown, then that would be a good argument. Because if you can show that God is likely to exist, that God has set these boundaries for us, and that it is wrong to cross those boundaries, and you can show that something exceeds the boundaries of our legitimate authority, then you can argue that we are acting wrongly. I mean, to use the obvious analogy, if we can show that a person, like a police officer or a judge or any official has this much authority, and they're acting outside of their authority, then we can reasonably infer they're acting wrongly, because we're supposed to stay within our spheres of authority. And exceeding one's authority is generally a bad thing. Now, to give one concrete example, again, going with the people who oppose capital punishment and euthanasia often take that view, that in terms of deciding who lives and who dies, that is God's purview. That's his authority. And if we decide when people live or die, we're exceeding our authority. We have no moral right to that. That's God's. We'd be playing God. Another example is like with genetic engineering. People tamper with, the created organisms. You could say, well, only God has a right to create organisms. If we're messing around with that, we're playing God. And again, the challenge is laying out those steps. If it can be done.
So with say you bring in like the death penalty, would that be like a playing God or a legalism?
You could bring in the playing God thing, because if you could argue, you could say, well, let's assume God exists, And what does God say about the right of killing? And you might say, well, you know, God says thou shalt not kill, but God reserves for himself the right to decide when things done. You could say, therefore, capital punishment would be wrong because it would be exceeding our authority. We have the capacity to kill, but we don't have the authority to kill. That's God's domain. Now, interesting enough, boringly enough, atheists can use this method, which seems kind of odd for them to be saying playing God, but they're saying make it happen without the literal. There is, instead of literal, the metaphorical version. Now in that case, you don't have to, obviously, since it's being a metaphor, you wouldn't prove God exists. What you try to show is, metaphorically, that there are boundaries we're supposed to operate in it. Again, it's basically a legitimate authority argument, and instead of like having God do this, you could argue without God, saying that we're supposed to operate here, within this sphere of authority. And if we cross over, we're acting as if we're God, and metaphorically, we're playing God. And that is exceeding our authority, therefore it's wrong. Now the challenge, of course, is laying out this boundary. What are the legitimate bounds of our authority to kill or modify organisms or do that stuff that's seen as God's deal? So basically the steps are, to be a little more concise about it. One, you lay out that there are supposedly these boundaries, either set by God, literally, or metaphorically, they're boundaries we must operate in whether God exists or not. And secondly, you show that or contend that breaking those bounds of authority would be wrong. Then you show that whatever it is that's being done exceeds those boundaries, therefore it's wrong. Or alternatively, you could argue that it's okay because it's within that realm of authority. Now, suppose you're on the receiving end of this. How do you respond to a charge of playing God? Well, kind of the first thing to ask is, if someone has hit you with a playing God charge, what have they actually done? And the person who's just waving their fist saying that's playing God. Well, it's fair to inquire, someone might say, is that all you got? And if all they got is, that's playing God, they got nothing. The response to that is, well, that person has no argument. So how can someone respond, if someone has a real argument, what could be a response? Well, here's how to respond. One thing, if you want to get like really theological or metaphysical, is you can engage on the God level. So if someone's going literal God, if you want to get into some theological, metaphysical battling, you can try to disprove God's existence, which would be pretty high-level stuff, not the kind of thing you'd probably do in the paper, but that would be a point of engagement. Because the way this method works literally is arguing for God, and the way to oppose it literally is to dispute whether God exists or not. The second option is to engage on the limits of authority. Because you could have two people who believe in God, but they might disagree about the limits God has set for us, or even if God has set us any limits at all. So one response might be, again, one high-level metaphysical theological response would be to raise an argument against God's existence. Option two is to say, well, the boundaries are bigger than the person claims, or maybe there are no limits. The next option is to look at the thing that it's being applied to try to show that it doesn't fall outside the boundaries, that it's inside of the boundaries. So kind of the main options are take God out of the picture, or take the boundaries out of the picture, or expand them, or take the thing in question to show that it fits within the boundaries. And of course, if you really want to go for thoroughness, you can do all of those methods. Now, another approach, a final approach, is this. This is only really effective if you're arguing against a particular viewpoint or person. And it's basically a consistency argument. Now, and here's how this particular version would work. Suppose someone is arguing about, let's say they're arguing about euthanasia, or youth in America, or youth in Europe. And of course, euthanasia is, the means like good death. And suppose they're against, basically assisted suicide, or someone committing suicide themselves. They're opposed to all that death. And their argument is that people should not kill themselves or assist others in killing people because that's God's decision. That here is our authority, and killing people is not in our authority. It belongs to God. It's God is to say when people live or die. Now, one way to engage someone if you know their position on other related issues is to go with a consistency thing. For example, suppose the person who's opposed to euthanasia says that's playing God, therefore it's forbidden, because it's not up to us to decide. Suppose the person favors capital punishment and killing in war. Well, if a person favors capital punishment is what?
Murder by the state.
Yeah, killing people. So if we can decide to kill people with capital punishment, then if this isn't playing God, if this is okay, then this would seem to be okay as well. Because if someone's saying, we are not to decide, it is up to God, in the case of euthanasia, we have no right to decide who lives and who dies, but then when the position of capital punishment is we have the right to kill people, and say like killing in war, they're fine with that, then as a consistency point, you can say, well, if we can play God here, then surely we can play God here. So it's acceptable to play God in some cases, we can play God in other cases as well. Now, what a person could do, of course, to try to counter the counter, is to bring up some relevant differences. They might say that, what people often point to, this is how the argument often goes, is suicide, for example, is forbidden, but killing criminals is okay because God has authorized us, whoever so sheddeth man's blood, by man's blood shall it be shed. You can bring up a theological argument as to say why God's giving us kill authority over each other, but only in cases of murderers and killers. So you could be consistent. You could say, well, God is not giving us self-kill authority, but he gives us authority to kill others, provided they've committed the right sorts of crimes, like being a witch or being disobedient children, for example, like we saw last time. And so that'd be a way to respond to the response. Now, in general, as I guess kind of a pro tip, this is usually just drama. Somebody's just saying, playing God. And usually you're better off using some other method rather than throwing a playing God thing. But it can be a legitimate argument. It just involves a challenge of laying out all that stuff and showing how, God exists, God has set these boundaries, this is outside the boundary, you shouldn't do this. Now what if we don't want to drag God into this? What's another option for us? Well, before we go into that, anything about this? It needs any examples, clarifications, meaningless hand gestures, anything? Okay. Now, so suppose you want to drag God to this, or you want to argue in like a similar vein, but add to it. Or suppose someone's an atheist and they're like, I don't want to bring God in this, but I want to argue a similar sort of deal. Well, something similar to the that's playing God argument is the unnatural argument. And this comes in a variety of forms. Again, often in sci-fi, horror, etc. In addition to the tamper with things we should not tamper with, we are playing God. That's why everyone's dead now. They'll often bring up the unnatural point. That's an unnatural thing to do. Usually involving combining like sharks and octopuses together. Also in again, when people are arguing in reality morally, people often throw out the unnatural thing. In some cases, they mean it goes against a natural order. In some cases, they're being very, very literal about it. They'll say it's unnatural because it does not occur in nature. It's just unnatural by definition. So how do you make the method work? Well, much like the playing God method, there's two broad approaches. The literal and the metaphorical. The literal approach requires there being a nature, a natural way of things, and requires that there be like a boundary, limits, and that things outside of that boundary are unnatural and therefore wrong. Now, fortunately, going back to like applying a moral theory, some dead philosophers have done the heavy lifting for us. If you want to, suppose you want to use the unnatural argument. You want to argue that something is outside of nature, so we shouldn't be doing it. Who can you call? Well, not the Ghostbusters, of course, but in this case, you can look at our good dead friend Aristotle, because he believed in a purposeful, meaningful world, where things, as we'll see when we talk about his view of ethics, he believes each creature has a nature, and to act in accord with that nature is how things should be. We should be, it's like the old army saying, be all you can be. Aristotle's view is we should be all we can be, specifically all we should be, based on our nature. Our good dead friend St. Thomas Aquinas basically takes Aristotle and adds a layer of Christianity on top of it. So you got Aristotle's pagan cake, and you put a Christian layer on top of that to clear up that paganism. And so you can use Aquinas as well. He believes in a natural order created by God. And if you want to go to the East, you can look at, for example, Taoism. They have the Tao, the way, and that literally tells us how things should be. Things should act in accord with their nature, the Tao, the way, and things that go against it are acting inappropriately and should not be doing that. So fortunately, when it comes to the unnatural argument, there have been thinkers, numerous thinkers, Lao Tzu, Aristotle, Aquinas, who've done the heavy lifting. They built theories of the natural world. Sometimes a theological component, like Aquinas, and sometimes like Aristotle. So if you take the literal approach, you can use one of those theories if you want, and have the boundaries. And then what you do essentially is say, there's a natural order, here are the boundaries set by the natural order, this is outside of the boundaries, therefore that is wrong, it's bad, something we should not do. Now you can also go metaphorical. You don't have to believe in a true metaphysical natural order. You could believe sort of metaphorically, there's a nature, there are limits in which we're supposed to operate. This is outside of those limits, and therefore it is wrong. Now again, the challenge there is kind of working out, what are the boundaries and why is crossing those boundaries wrong. It's doable, but, requires a fair amount of work. So what would be an example of this? Well, I'll give a couple examples. One is, again, with my high quality, no expense spared Microsoft clip art. We've got, of course, the two sheep and the scientist with supposed to be a test tube, looks kind of like a microphone. Or like a magic wand. Maybe it's Harry Potter. Oh, magic sheep. Sheepicus, duplicus, pow. It's not good at magic. So, many years ago, there was a famous cloning of a sheep dolly. Took a sheep, cloned it. Ta-da, two sheep. And we raised the various ethical questions, about cloning stuff. And people brought up the unnatural argument, that there is a boundary in which we should operate, and cloned sheep lie outside that boundary, therefore we should not be cloning sheep. Another example, one thing that's probably even more horrifying than cloning is essentially taking DNA mixing. Everyone's probably seen the horror movies that begin with DNA mixing. You get things like, Sharktopus and stuff like that. And we all know from South Park the pig and elephant DNA don't mix. Classic lesson in science. Now, what scientists often do is they combine the genes, it's routine practice. They combine gene species between, take genes out of one thing, put it in another. For example, they have, I think, grown human ears on mice, for example, combined, jellyfish DNA with mice, and they've even made spider goats. Now you're probably picturing something, cool looking like like an eight-legged goat running on the ceiling, or horrifying, like an eight-legged goat running on the ceiling. But the spider goats, you wouldn't be able to tell by looking at them that they were spider goats. What they did is, well, scientists realized, one thing you probably noticed if you run into spider webs is they're pretty strong and sticky. I mean, for their size, they're very strong. And people have long thought, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we could get all that, harvest all that spider silk to make stuff, because it's stronger than steel and light. But people thought, having giant spiders would be a bad, if it were possible, which pretty clear it's not, would be pretty awful. If you ever seen movies like Arachnophobia or Eight-Legged Freaks, you know why you do not want giant, or Lord of the Rings, you know why you don't want giant spiders running around. Because picture a spider is like as big as a dog running around.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want that happening. Now, so what they did is they figured, hey, let's combine spider DNA with goats. And so that way what they'll do is, the plan was, the goats will produce spider protein in their milk, and they melt the goats, and they strain out the protein, and then make the stuff. And so they look like normal goats, they act like normal goats, except they produce spider proteins in their milk, so far. Who knows what else will happen to them. And so people could argue is that would be, that would go outside the bounds of nature. Now, you could argue that natural creatures, deserve our respect, so we should not be tampering with their DNA. Now, and of course, there are many other examples as well. Last example I'll give on the argument side is this. As I mentioned, one of the simplest ways of using this method is to simply say, nature is literally what occurs naturally. It's as simple as that. If you show that something does not occur in nature, therefore it's wrong. This doesn't occur in nature, it's wrong. One standard example of this, the debate over homosexuality and same-sex marriage. One sort of classic argument against it is that homosexuality does not occur in nature. What doesn't occur in nature is wrong. Therefore, homosexuality is wrong. So those are some classic arguments using this method. So how do you respond to it? Well, much like with the playing God argument, a couple of ways. One option is, this is again, involves doing metaphysics and sciencey stuff. You could go after the notion that there is a natural order. There is such a thing. Next thing you could argue is that the boundaries aren't where the person claims. You might say, okay, yes, I'll accept this as a natural order, but the boundaries aren't where the person, my opponent, claims they are. They are out, here's my opponent claims they are, but they're out further. So this is okay. Or maybe there's no boundaries, so everything's okay. And of course, another option is to say, well, my opponent claims that it's here, but it's actually here. It's cool. It's within nature. For example, and the last two responses. Now, if you're arguing against someone who makes the unnatural argument, and this is only effective as a consistency point, if you can show that other things that the person accepts are analogous to what supposedly is unnatural, you can push them into that inconsistency, the consistent application thing. So a person says, this is wrong because it's unnatural, but they accept the same sort of thing as being okay, they really have two options. One is they can say, well, I guess this is okay because it's similar, or they could try to show that there's a relevant difference between the two, to try to show that although this is okay, this is not, despite their seeming alike, they're really not alike. For example, suppose someone argues against genetic engineering, genetically modifying, animals and crops. And there's a lot of debate now about that. Everyone's probably heard by now of GMOs. In fact, I was at when I was doing my grocery shopping on Friday morning, because no one's at the grocery store Friday morning at 7 a.m., perfect time to shop. And I was looking, I saw like a bag, I think it was like a bag of chips or something, it said no GMOs. And so I can tell GMOs or lack thereof is kind of a big concern. And of course GMOs are genetically modified organisms. They're things like potatoes, some that have been genetically altered. And a lot of people are concerned about that for a variety of reasons. There's some concerns that they'll be harmful, they'll somehow be dangerous to us, either maybe toxic or the genes will somehow affect us. And of course, there are other concerns about people are sort of worried about corporations, doing that, because the idea of think of many horror movies. How many horror movies involve corporations messing with genetics? Movies like Resident Evil, for example. When you hear corporation, genetic modification, you probably think monster. Probably comes up pretty quick. Now, one way to respond to that unnatural argument is to show that we already do such things and they're accepted. So if suppose someone is arguing, that GMO stuff is awful, it goes against nature, we shouldn't accept any of that, that's unnatural. And you could ask the person, well, do you like popcorn? Do you like corn? Most people will say yes. And you ask them, do you like steak and cow's milk? And do you like, not even dogs, but do you like dogs? Most people say yeah. Now all that stuff, corn, etc., the cows we have, they're all genetically modified. The original corn, corn's a grass, and the original corn, if you saw the original corn, wouldn't look much like corn. It'd be kind of a similar. It looked like basically a big stalk of grass essentially. But what we did is our ancestors just kept selecting. You get a slightly bigger ear, you breed that with similar corn, keep breeding and breeding and breeding it, and a long time later you've got corn like we have today. Similar with the type of tomatoes we get. The type of tomatoes they sell in supermarkets, those were selected for and bred. Dogs originated as gray wolves. Now we have everything from the noble husky to the lowly chihuahua. They're all dogs, but they're the results of our genetic modification. So if all the stuff we've done in the past is okay. Oh, carrots, use a final example. The original carrots were just they were sort of brownish roots, small. And now they're that bright orange color and have all kinds of good nutrients and stuff. But that's totally us. We made that happen. And so if we can accept that kind of stuff, then genetic modification, you could argue, we've been doing it since the beginning. It's very natural to us. Therefore, we could say that GMOs are fine. There's nothing wrong with them because we've been GMOing since we've been around. Now, of course, what you could do to respond back to this is do the relevant difference thing. Now, is there a difference between, say, selecting better, the corn you like, keep planting those seeds, and genetically modifying things by inserting genes into them? Could there be a relevant difference there? Yeah, because you could argue that breeding is a natural process. Sure, we're artificially, we're selecting what we want, but we're dealing with natural stuff. But if we take genes and splice them in, you might argue that crosses the boundary. That's a relevant difference. So it's one relevant difference to say, hey, look, we got two dogs that have some traits we like. So let's breed those dogs and keep breeding dogs with those traits and get to a husky or a small chihuahua. You can say, well, yeah, that's one thing. But taking a gene, putting it into something, directly modifying, you could say would be relevantly different. One is using the natural process. The other involves, say, tampering with nature. Now, what about the nature argument? It doesn't occur in nature, so it's wrong, or occurs in nature, so it's good. And people often make that argument. Not only in morality, people often say, well, it's unnatural, it's wrong, it doesn't occur in nature. Or people will say, well, it's natural, so it's good. And this, of course, occurs also outside of ethics. For example, take herbal medicines. Often they advertise them by saying it's natural, natural means good. Or they'll say no artificial ingredients, because artificial is supposed to be bad. And we often think that, natural good, artificial, non-natural bad. But of course, and this leads us into some, philosophy stuff, is everything natural good? Would you say, this is natural, so it's perfectly safe? No, because there's all kinds of things. I mean, there's nothing more natural than cobra venom. I wouldn't want to be bit by a cobra. Cyanide occurs in nature. It actually occurs in apples. What would you want to eat cyanide? Yeah, because it's poisonous. Similarly, herpes. That's 100% all natural. You know, you wouldn't want to go to the store and buy a bag of that. It's herpes. It's not GMO. It's all natural. It's low cost, and it lasts forever. Yeah, it's totally natural, but you don't want that. I'm not speaking from experience. Just theory. Yeah, so there's all kinds of things that are natural that are horrible. Similarly, there's lots of stuff we might say are artificial, like lights, watches, smartphones, clothing, shoes. All this stuff, there's no like shoe tree in nature, or glasses tree, or iPad tree. But we generally don't think of those things as being bad. Yeah, so the idea that nature is automatically good and artificial and unnatural is bad, clearly not true. Now, I mean, there are some reasons to believe that natural stuff can be like somewhat safer. Because people do argue, for example, stepping aside of ethics again, I think when people talk about like the paleo diet, where you go back and eat how our ancestors supposedly ate. Now you could make an argument that things that were naturally, say, evolved to eat could be better for us. And say, well, this is what is natural for humans to consume. And so you could make an argument that things like apples and oranges and broccoli and lettuce is better than, say, Cheez Whiz or highly processed foods. But merely saying it's natural, it's good, it's unnatural, it's bad, not a good argument. Now, what about the point that if someone argues, well, it's not occurring in nature, it's not, it's bad. Well, I'll use a concrete example. As I mentioned, one of the standard arguments against homosexuality in the past was it's unnatural. Literally, the claim is it does not occur in nature. And that becomes a factual dispute. Does it occur in nature or does it not? And of course, some years back, the Daily Show, because that's what they do, they were interviewing someone who was making that argument, that homosexuality does not occur in nature, therefore it's wrong. And being the Daily Show, of course, they had to go do something sarcastic. So Samantha Bee went to, I think it was like an aquarium, I think it might have been in Boston or New York or something, where they had gay penguins. And they went to talk to an expert biologist and said, are these penguins gay? And the biologist was like, yes, these penguins are in fact gay penguins. And the biologist said that homosexuality occurs all through nature. And if the person's right, then we'd have to say, well, if the argument is it doesn't occur in nature, so it's wrong, if it does occur in nature, we have to say that it is okay then. And so yeah, the way to respond to the argument it doesn't occur in nature, one option is, well, being natural doesn't mean automatically good, and unnatural doesn't mean automatically bad. And you can also do the factual dispute, that it does in fact occur in nature. It does occur. Which doesn't automatically, of course, make it good. Now, how do they know the penguins were gay? Well, here's how the reasoning went. Penguins, of course, wear what? Yeah, tuxedos. And you wear tuxedos when? When do you wear a tuxedo? All the time? You could. You're Bruce Wayne.
Weddings.
Yeah, weddings. And so the penguins, they all look identical. So they're just marrying everybody. So the odds are they'll be marrying, guy penguin, girl penguin, girl penguin. So it's just clear. And you got to pity those penguins because, well, if they're engaged in that kind of behavior, clearly going to hell. And so why should we, in the case of penguins, where do they live?
Together.
Yeah, where it's cold. And so those poor gay penguins going to hell, where it's very hot. So you must pity the poor gay, hellbound penguins. That's just science. That's just science. No. So the argument that some things occur in nature, and so therefore they're good, or are natural because they're making them bad, more than that is required. So that brings us to the end, conveniently enough, of our unnatural argument, and that's probably all you need to know about penguins. But except for the Marshall Penguins, which I highly recommend, because it's got Morgan Freeman, and he can make anything sound awesome.